David, how are you, dude?
Doing fine, Aaron. Hope you are.
I am. Thanks so much for taking some time to join me. I thought you would be a good guest to bring on. You cover the SEC, but you're obviously around that Tennessee program a lot with the game coming up. I want to get your thoughts in your history of covering this game, the third Saturday in October. Where do you think it currently sits as a rivalry? Or Tennessee fans, do they still get as pumped up for it as they used to, or is divisional play in Florida becoming much more? Is it taking some of the juice out of that? Where are Tennessee fans in that program? How do they think of this rivalry now?
Aaron, they would like for it still to be a rivalry, but obviously you have to have more competition for it to be considered that way. When you're talking about the older age groups, those in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, they still view Alabama as their biggest rivalry, where you touched on Florida and maybe even Georgia to a lesser degree. Of course, that's a big one around here in Chattanooga being right on the line. But the younger fans kind of view Florida as the bigger rival. But when I'm 50 and my age and older, it's all about Alabama with Tennessee, even though they're not in the same divisions. But, I mean, it's just as far as this year, I mean, I have a radio show from 3 to 6 Eastern each day, and we are just getting no calls from Tennessee fans because they just feel like they're marching to a funeral this week.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. Now, we live in an age of social media where fans, you can connect with them and get your kind of finger on the pulse a lot quicker than maybe you could in the past. And I put out a tweet on Monday that I overheard Rocky Top. It was being played in the Alabama athletic training room as players were preparing for practice, and they're getting taped and they're getting treatment. And I must have had 200 Tennessee fans interact with that said the same thing, that, well, they might as well hear it this week because they're not going to hear it in the game because we're not going to score. Is that more right now to do with maybe how good Alabama is, or kind of what I think it is, that just the mood and the overall attitude of the Tennessee fan base with Butch Jones is just not really good and maybe poisonous right now?
Yeah, it's a really bad offense right now, Aaron. I mean, they've made the quarterback change last week, but Garantano wasn't showing you anything in ball games, at least, to warrant the change for Dormady. It's a situation where if you look at their quarterback, I mean, Dormady against Georgia Tech was probably the best performance by either one of those quarterbacks all year, and we're talking Labor Day night. So it's obvious there's been no improvement. There's actually been regressing there, but Tennessee heads into this game having not scored in 10 quarters. And, Georgia accounts for 4 of those quarters, and that's a pretty good defense. But, UMass, 0-6 UMass, the second half of that game is when this streak started, and then not to score a touchdown against South Carolina. I mean, Aaron, there's a historical Big Six in the SEC with Tennessee, Georgia, and Florida in the East, and with Alabama, Auburn, and LSU in the West. And so South Carolina is a team that, even though South Carolina has been better than Tennessee in most recent years because of Spurrier, you can't lose to South Carolina and it be considered a good season if you're from Tennessee, especially if you can't score a touchdown on them.
David, is John Kelly, is he getting enough carries? I mean, when I watch him, he may be one of the best running backs in the SEC, and sometimes he goes missing in this offense.
Yeah, the Florida game especially. Why he wasn't used more there is a real head-scratcher. I can see the last call in Saturday's game, South Carolina, either way. I mean, when you've got one tick on the clock and you're 2 yards away, I can see giving it to Kelly. I can also see the throw that they made because, I mean, it really was just millimeters away from being a game-winning touchdown. He is a good back, but he's also a back that if Tennessee doesn't have balance, he's not Superman. I mean, he is a good SEC back, but he's not Superman. So, I mean, Tennessee's going to have to hit some early throws if they want to establish John Kelly in this game, and that's something that I'm not sure if they can do as far as getting the passing game going.
One of the fans thinking of Butch Jones right now. Obviously, he's not done himself any favors from time to time from a PR standpoint and says things that the fan base doesn't really like or, and quite frankly, embarrasses them sometimes. But Where is this guy in terms of his job security?
It's amazing, Aaron. We really shouldn't even be having this conversation. You mentioned the PR bit. I mean, if he had, and this is what's kind of fun, especially from an Alabama standpoint. You think about Alabama in back-to-back weeks. They're playing coaches, fifth-year coaches. I mean, Brett Bielema and Butch Jones both took over messes. I mean, Bielema took over from the John L. Smith interim year after the Bobby Petrino fiasco. Butch Jones took over for Derek Dooley, whose last game was a 41-18 loss to Vanderbilt. And each program each coach has done a good job up until the end of last season of kind of building things up. But if you go back to late last season, Arkansas had the problem of blowing big leads at halftime. They did it against Missouri in their regular season finale, and then against Virginia Tech in their bowl game. And in Tennessee, because of a lot of injuries, really, they just bottomed out defensively last year and couldn't stop anybody. So you saw the momentum that Bielema and Butch Jones had been building kind of come to an end. And I like bringing those up because when you think about some of their press conference situations, Aaron. I mean, Brett Bielema has literally bawled after ball games. I mean, he bawled after the 14-13 loss to Alabama a few years ago in Fayetteville. I mean, the guy is just passionate about we're going to get this thing turned around. And if you're a fan of Arkansas, you want Brett Bielema to work because you get the passion that he shares and the love and the desire. Nobody is questioning how hard Brett Bielema is working there. He's just not getting it done for this or that reason. And with Butch Jones, it's totally different. I mean, he's this robot in press conferences that has these just atrocious cliches of champions of life, five-star hearts, leadership reps being the latest one. And you just want him to show a human element instead of just going back to the same old individuals in the quarterback position and resiliency and the same stuff. And he's had a history, Aaron, of challenging the media in news conferences. And that's not something you can do when you have his one-loss record.
Yeah, if you're going to do that, you have to win. And when you don't and the local media turns on you, it's an ugly scene. Talking to David Paschall, covers the SEC for the Chattanooga Times Free Press. David, from an outside looking in perspective in the conference, how is Alabama viewed? I mean, obviously they're the number one team in the country, and they've built kind of this behemoth, but they're not being challenged on a weekly basis outside of maybe the Texas A&M game, and even that game they had a double-digit lead with 20 seconds left. Do you think it's more of a Alabama's just that good, or how much of it is the SEC is not very good?
It's definitely a combination. I mean, I know that's the easier way out, but you've got Alabama outscoring everybody 48-8. I mean, I've got friends of mine who are Alabama graduates that admit that they thought this was a really fun league 6 or 7 years ago when Alabama had already gotten good under Saban and had won a national championship, even their second one under Saban. But, back at that time, the SEC was on a stretch of winning 7 straight national championships with 4 different schools. And so when an Alabama beat an Auburn or beat a Florida or beat an LSU, it meant something. And you go back to, last year Alabama beat Florida 54-16, and you're just kind of like, I mean, I've even got Alabama friends of mine who are graduates that are like, it's just not as fun anymore. And, so a lot of this is Saban chewing up and spitting out the rest of this league. There's no question the coaches, and I'm not the first to bring this up, Aaron, and you know that. I mean, the coaches in this league are nothing compared to what they were a decade ago. I always thought that one of the great arguments you could have in the SEC was going back to the end of the 2007 season, so basically almost going back a full decade, and having a debate on who the best coach was. Saban had just had that first year at Alabama, which, wound up in Shreveport, but of course, Alabama, he had won the national championship at LSU, and you knew he was a good coach. Steve Spurrier was just getting going at South Carolina and had won a national championship at Florida. Philip Fulmer was in the league with a national championship. Urban Meyer was in the league with a national championship, about to win a second one. Les Miles had just won a national championship. Mark Richt had just finished second in the country. Tommy Tuberville had a 13-0 season and was on a really good run at that time. Houston Nutt was transferring from Arkansas to Ole Miss, but was really highly thought of. Rich Brooks was an incredibly underrated coach and did some great things at Kentucky. That's 9 of the 14 coaches who are really either thought to be elite or really, really good. And right now you've got Nick Saban and you've got this emerging Kirby Smart. And, you know, I think Malzahn's pretty good. I think Dan Mullen's pretty good. But, I mean, it's just nothing when you paint the picture of a decade ago.
David, speaking of Kirby Smart in Georgia, they certainly have got things rolling over there. And you've seen them. I haven't seen them in person. I imagine you have. Are they good enough to be one-dimensional on offense if a team is able to stop their running game, which is a tall order? That is a big task. That running game is pretty potent. But if they run into Auburn and Auburn can slow them down, or Alabama, is Jake Fromm as a freshman, is he good enough to carry them?
You know, it's one of those where he would have to do. It's kind of, if you go back to like A.J. McCarron in that Sugar Bowl against LSU. You know, they had the 9-6 loss in the regular season, and you know, McCarron at the time was viewed as a game manager. Well, if you go back to that game, the offensive game plan in New Orleans was kind of put on him to make the early plays in the passing game, which he did. And of course, you know, they go on to win 21-0. I think Fromm has that same kind of ability. So I don't think it would be fair to call Georgia one-dimensional. I mean, because Fromm has shown, you know, he's the SEC leader in efficiency, and granted, you know, his running backs help, but he's got a receiver in Javon Wims that's really good at catching the ball at the highest point, and he's a good jump ball type of receiver. Terry Godwin is having a really good junior year. They're a little more experienced. Isaac Nauta as a tight end is as good as anybody around. So they really do have a lot of nice pieces for him. And really, he's got to kind of be, as a true freshman, the way McCarron was his first year as a starter. I mean, you followed him all along. McCarron got much better in 12 and better in 13, but you know, that one night down in New Orleans, it was put on him, and he got it done. And I think Fromm's got that same type of ability. Should it come down to, you know, whether it's an SEC title game against Bama or if they meet again in the playoffs down the road, I think he's got the ability to keep them competitive.